Swifters, this is Prof G. Are you ready to be authorities on authentication? Well, in this lesson, we're going to learn to set up an authentication service in our Firebase app, and we'll write SwiftUI code so that users can create an account with an email and password, and then use those credentials to log into our app anytime they want. Let the coding continue. So at the end of our last lesson, which was the first lesson in building the Snacktacular app, we set up our Xcode project, we used Swift Package Manager to install several Firebase and Cloud Firestore packages, and we set up our Firebase app in Google's cloud. Now we're ready to work with authentication. Now we'll do this over 3 videos. In this first video, we'll get sign up and logging in working. Then in the next lesson, we'll refine the user interface by allowing the user to travel between email and password fields using the keyboard. We'll also provide some validation checks to the user interface and provide some feedback if they get something wrong. Then we'll show how to programmatically move to the first screen after login by using the ability to programmatically navigate using a navigation stack. When we're done, we'll have a set of code that you should be able to drop in to just about any new SwiftUI Firebase app whenever you want to quickly set up sign up and login services. And while this will let us get up and running while we're learning new concepts, we'll be able to return to this code and add more features later. Our goal is to get some quick sign up and login code working so that we can get into the real action, which is saving and loading data in the cloud. So let's start in the Firebase console. This is where you set up your Snacktacular app in the browser during our last lesson. Make sure you're signed in and you're in your Snacktacular app, since that's where we want to add authentication services, and then just click on Authentication. Then click on the Get Started button, and we see a bunch of different login options available, but each one requires a different set of login code. They each have a separate API. So for now, we'll simply use the email and password. But again, we can add more login options in the future. Just know that the code we write here isn't drop-in compatible with these other different types of login. Each one has their own special SDK. So click on email and password, then click enable email and password, and we're not going to offer passwordless sign-in, so we can leave that unchanged, then click save. So we've got email and password enabled. You can click on add new provider, but we're going to migrate off of this screen in just a bit. Then let's head back to Xcode and we'll add login code. Now we're going to do that in our content view. So click content view in the project navigator. Now first, I'm going to change the name of content view to login view. So I'll right click on content view in the struct definition, select refactor rename, change the name to login view and press return. And while it's not necessary to change the comment or preview provider name, I'm going to do this anyway. So I'm just going to copy login view, paste it in my first comment line, and over the content view portion of the content view preview provider, I'll paste it in over there too. Now, since we're going to be working with parts of the Firebase libraries, we need to import Firebase just below import SwiftUI. Now, instead of using a VStack, I'm going to use a navigation stack because we'll eventually want to programmatically navigate to a new full screen view. So just below the line that declares our body variable, I'll add navigation stack, open and close curlies. Then I'll delete the VStack through the padding, and in between the navigation stack, we'll start off with an image view that's going to contain our logo. So I'll say image, no attribute in here, but I'll pass in the string logo. That's lowercase logo. This logo file is in our assets catalog. You should have installed that at the start of the last lesson. That was in the resources that we downloaded from the Google Drive. And then below this, we'll add modifiers for .resizable, .scale to fit, and .padding with a standard padding, nothing between the parens. And now I'm going to add fields to enter email and password. And since there are going to be some modifiers that are common between these two, I'm going to put them inside of a group and add the modifiers below the group. So I'll say group, open and close curlies, and we're going to want to create state variables to get the user entered information. So up top, I'll say @state private var email equals empty string, and @state private var password equals empty string. Then back inside our group, why don't we add our text field? We'll select our option with title and text, and for title, I'll enter the string email, and the text needs to be a binding value. This will be $email, which is a state variable we just created, but for our password, we're not going to enter a text field here. Instead, we're going to use something new. Enter secure field, and highlight this option with title and text, just like the text field had. But in a secure field, you can't see the letters as they're typed, and there's some other things that make this field more secure, like it disables copy and paste so that you can't copy the password that's entered here. So press return to accept this. For our title string, we'll enter password, which will be grayed out inside the prompt, just like it is with text field. And for the text that needs to be a binding value, we'll say $password. That's the other state variable we created above. Now below the group, let's add some modifiers to apply to both of these fields. We can add .text field style. This will also apply to the secure field, and we'll pass in .rounded border. and we'll add standard dot padding. And I always think that the rounded border is too faint. I like a darker border, and we learned how to do this in an earlier lesson. So we'll add a dot overlay modifier with open and close curlies. I'll add mine just above the padding, and passing in rounded rectangle, that's with a capital R because this is a view, not a modifier. Select the corner radius option, we'll pass in 5. Then below the rounded rectangle, let's add a dot stroke modifier with dot gray passed in between the parens as the color. And why don't we also add comma, line width, and after the colon, we'll pass in 2. And I think this gray is still a little too dark, but we can tone it down. So right after dot gray in between the parens, we'll add dot opacity, passing in 0.5. That'll give us 50% transparency. And I think that looks good. But I also think we've got too much padding between these views. So for dot padding, I'm just going to pass in dot horizontal here to get rid of the vertical padding, and I think this looks much better. Now let's add sign up and login buttons side by side in an H stack. So we'll add an H stack with open and close curlies, and then I'll add a button. I'll select the option with action and label, although you could use a title since we're just passing in a text view. Then press return for the trailing closures, and I'll delete the code placeholder in the action, and for the label, I'll add text and pass in the string login. Then I'll highlight all this button code, paste it below so I've got a second button, and for the string inside the first button's text view, I'm going to change that to sign up. Then below the H stack, I'll add a button style modifier passing in dot border prominent. And I'm realizing I advanced my setup video too quickly at the start of the last lesson. I created a special color to match the orangish color used in the Snacktacular logo. Now we've done this before, but let's do it again together. So click the asset catalog in the project navigator, then click plus in the lower left to add a new asset and select color set. You'll be allowed to name the color set. Let's call this snack color, upper camel case, press return. Then I'll click the first color box, open up the inspector's pane, and under the appearances, select none. This will give us just a single color to work with, which is what we want. Then click the show color panel in the lower right, and in the color panel, click the eyedropper tool, and then move the eyedropper over the darkest part of the orange on the Snacktacular logo up here. You'll have to position yourself very precisely, but once you've got the dropper over that color, click there, and that'll add a color to the snack color. That's it. We've now got a custom color named snack color, so we can return to login view and use this. So now we can add a dot tint modifier, and we'll pass in capital C color, choose the option with a name, and in the name we're going to add the string snack color, upper camel case, just like we spelled it in the asset catalog. And look at that, we've got our buttons in the snack color. Then I'll set a dot font modifier to dot title 2, and I can add a little bit more padding to the top by saying dot padding dot top. And I'll add some padding between these buttons by, after the first button, adding dot padding dot trailing, and after the second button, adding dot padding dot leading. And I think that's nicely spaced out. And so now we need to add some functions which are going to act as the actions for these two buttons. So first, let's add our signup function just before the closing curly. In our struct, we'll add func. We'll call this register, open and close parens, open and close curlies. And then we'll write some code to authenticate our user. And here's how we do it. Type in capital A auth, that's AUTH, dot lowercase auth. We'll enter this with an open and close parens afterward, and then dot create user. Select this option with the email, password, and completion handler, and we want the completion handler, so hold down the option key as we press return. All three of those parameters will be entered, and this is how we create a new user. Now for the with email parameter, we'll just pass in our email variable. For our password parameter, that'll be our password variable. Press return on the completion handler, and it will pass in two values for us. A result, why don't we call that lowercase result, and an optional error value, why don't we call that lowercase error. Then we'll first check to see if we have an error. So if we say if let error equals error, open and close curlies, this happens if we get an error, meaning the error is non-nil. And for now, we'll just print out in double quotes, login error, colon, string interp, error.localized description. And I always like to put an angry emoji in front of my errors. And you know what? I'd also like to show an alert if we get this error. And here's how we set up our alert. First, we want to create a bool value that's going to tell us whether or not the alert is showing. So we'll say @state private var showing alert. We'll initially set this equal to false. And I'm also going to create a variable to hold our alert message. So I'll say @state private var alert message equals, and initially this is going to be the empty string. Then down in our register function, in the if clause, if we have an error, I'll say alert message equals, and in between the double quotes, I'm just going to copy and paste my error login code with the localized description, and that'll be the message that shows up if the user gets a sign-in error. Then after this, to show the alert, I'm going to set showing alert equal to true, but we haven't set up our alert yet, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to add it just before the closing curly in the navigation stack up here. Start typing in .alert and select the option that has the title key, is presented, and actions. Now notice what code completion says down here. It says it presents an alert when a given condition is true using a localized string for the title. So that title is going to be our alert message, and the is presented binding Boolean value is going to be our showing alert value. We want to use all of these parameters, so hold down the option key and press return. So title key is alert message, and the binding variable for is presented is going to be $showing alert. When this is set to true, that means our alert is going to show. Then tab over to Actions, press Return for trailing closure format, and inside the curlies, we're just going to put a button. But for the button, select this option that we haven't used before with the title key, the role in the action. Now, the title key is going to be the string OK. That's just going to be the label for the button. Then tab over to the role, and in here we'll say .cancel. So that's just going to cancel the alert when the user clicks on this button. And then for the action, actually, we don't even need an action. So what we can do is we can finish this off with a closing paren and just have empty curlies after the cancel. Then back down in our register function, let's put an else clause after the if let. And let's create a simple print statement just to indicate that our sign up worked properly. So we'll say print in between parens and double quotes. I'm going to add a cool emoji because I think it's cool that somebody just signed up. And I'll follow this with registration success. And below this, I'm going to put a to-do comment that just says load list view, because if the user signed in, we want to go to the list view so they can start using the app. And we haven't created the list view yet, but we will. Then as the button action for the sign up button, we need to call that register function that we just wrote. Now another thing we'll want to do is to set the navigation bar title display mode to inline. If we don't do that, we're going to have a large blank space at the top of our view, and we don't want that. So we can actually add this with these modifiers for the H stack. Just say .navigation bar title display mode and pass in .inline, and that'll make sure the default large title doesn't show up. Again, if we didn't do that, we'd have a big blank space up top. So now let's try this out. I'm going to click on the play button and run in the simulator. Then I'm going to head to the browser and take a look at the Firebase console. And in the authentication area, click on the users tab. And currently we don't see any users in here, but we're about to sign up our first user and they'll eventually show up here. But first let's head over to our app, and our interface isn't completely built out yet, but let's try this. We'll enter an email address and I'm seeing a few things that we're going to want to change. See how the text field capitalizes the first letter by default? We don't want that in email addresses. Those are always lowercase. They're actually case insensitive, but the standard is to write them without capital letters. And also, my keyboard isn't showing, but if I press Command K to bring it up, look what happens when I type my first name. Autocorrect capitalizes this even if I don't press the caps key. And also, iOS has a special keyboard that I'll show you. We can specify to show a special email keyboard that has symbols like the @ symbol on the same screen as the letter. It just makes it easier for the user to type in their email address. So let me show you how we can fix this with modifiers to our text field view. So under text field, first we'll add .keyboard type, and we'll pass in .email address. This will give us that special email address keyboard. And then we'll also add .autocorrect disabled to disable the autocorrection, and we'll enter .text input autocapitalization, passing in .never, so that things entered in the email field will never be autocapitalized. And for the password in our secure field, we don't want the email keyboard for this, and autocorrection is actually disabled in the secure field by default, but I'm going to highlight and copy this text input autocapitalization never modifier I created above, and I'm going to paste it in the secure field. Honestly, I actually don't know if we need this in a secure field. This may be the default value, but it's not going to hurt to paste this in anyway. But I'm also going to modify the keyboard for the secure field. I'm going to enter a .submit label modifier and pass in the value .done. Now this is going to change the return button on the keyboard so that it shows up with the done label, and we'll customize how this works in a subsequent lesson, but at least for now, we'll set this up so that it says done. And as for the text field, we're also going to add a .submit label modifier up here, but here we're going to pass in .next. Now we'll eventually write some code so that when you press .next, it will automatically move the cursor from the email field to the password field, which is almost always what the user wants to do. So now let's build and run, and I'll click in the email field, and again, if your keyboard doesn't pop up, press Command K, and will you look at this? We see the special email keyboard with the @ symbol next to the space bar. And as I start to enter my name, it's not auto-capitalized, which is great. It's also not auto-corrected, which is what I want. So I'm going to enter my email address. I ask that you kindly don't spam me, and please don't email me asking me to debug your code. Now also notice that the button in the lower right says next. This is what happens when we change the submit label. That's what we wanted. But when we tap it, it doesn't move us to the next field. Again, we're going to write code to do that in the next lesson. but we can click on the password field. Notice as we start to type, you can't see the letters, which is what we want. Very cool. That's because we're using a secure field here. Also notice that the return button now says done. That's what we did with our submit label modifier for our secure field. And I'm going to deliberately try to create an account with a 4-character password. Then I'll click sign up and ho! The alert pops up. It says login error. Password must be 6 characters long or more. So our alert is working. And the text that we're seeing in here is the error.localize description. Nice. So I'm going to enter a longer password, then click sign up, and let's look at the screen behind us where it shows the users. Now this doesn't refresh automatically, so I don't see the user that I just created. But what happens if I click sign up again? Then I get another sign in error, but this is a different one. It states that the email address is already in use by another account, so it must have created the user the first time. And click OK, but I'm going to click in the browser on the back. I'll click in the address bar and press return to refresh, and ho-ho, will you look at that? The first user is signed up in our system. Nice! We see their email address here, we see the date they signed in, looking good. Now there are no more email checks as part of sign up, so I can enter another bogus user. How about a@bc.edu? This isn't a valid email address. I'll click sign up, and again, normally we would head to a different view in our app, but we haven't coded that yet. But if we head back to our browser and refresh our users view, we can see our second user is created as well. So sign up is working great. Congratulations. And by the way, if you wanted to work with a user's account, you could hover your cursor over to the far right of the account. You'll see 3 vertical dots show up, and if you click that, you'll get options to reset password, disable account, or delete account. So this is looking good. Now let's head back to Xcode and we'll write a login function. Now we'll do that right after our register function with func login, open and close parens, and open and close curlies. And we'll start this the same way as our create user method above with capital A auth, dot lowercase a auth with parens. Then we'll enter dot sign in and select the option with email and password and hold down the option key when pressing this so that all 3 parameters are entered, including the completion handler. So our email should be email, our password should be password, those are 2 variables we created, and press return on the completion handler for our trailing closure format. And again, here we enter 2 values, and again I'm going to use result for the first one and error for the second one. And as for the code that I want in here, I'm actually just going to highlight this if-else clause from above, copy it, and paste it below. And ooh, I'm noticing down here that it's correct when it says login error, but above I should change this to, how about sign in error, but it would have been better if I called this registration error. That's a little more clear, or actually maybe it's not clear, we'll change that again later on. But if I build and run, that's not going to work because I haven't called this function in our login button action. Again, very common error. Dope! So we'll head back to Xcode, and actually to distinguish my messages, in this second error message down here, I'm going to change the cool emoji before the login error to a log emoji. You might not have even known that there was a log emoji, but there is. And now in the button action for the login button, I'm going to call the login function. I'm going to build and run, and if I log in with one of the users that I just created using the correct password, look down in the console, I see my log emoji, and it shouldn't say registration success. That's another thing that I need to change. But now if I refresh the authentication panel in the browser, I actually don't see any changes here, and I don't expect to see any. But there is a sign in column in here with the last date signed in. So tomorrow if I sign in, I'll actually see the updated sign in for the user that signs in 1 day later. And you can try to purposely generate some other errors in here. So if you enter an invalid email address and click login, you see the auto-generated error message that says there is no user record corresponding to this identifier. That means the email address is not valid. And we'll head back to Xcode and we'll correct those errors that we noticed. So let's see. Down here in the login function, that's where we want to go, just after the login emoji. Why don't we write login successful? And why don't we change our error in the registration function? So instead of sign in error, why don't we call this sign up error? I think that's more accurate. And with that, Swifter, you've got registration and login working with Firebase authentication. So now we'll refine this in the next 2 lessons. First, so that we can move our email field to the password field just by using our keyboard, and pressing done on the keyboard in the password field will dismiss the keyboard. And then after that, we'll add some programmatic navigation. So if we log in or sign up successfully, we'll navigate to a new list view that we haven't created yet. But feel good about those amazing authentication skills you've acquired, you fabulous Firebase programmer. Keep hacking!